There are moments in history when the darkness between streetlights feels alive, when the shadow at the edge of your vision seems to breathe, when something standing on the periphery of the known world steps just for a moment into the light, and when it does, it smiles, not the way a person smiles, not the way a friend greets you after a long absence or the way a stranger offers a polite acknowledgement on a crowded street. No, this smile is wrong. This smile is too wide, too still, too permanent. As though it was carved there by something that never quite understood what smiling was supposed to mean. As though the muscles of the face had been arranged by something that had only ever read about human emotion in a book and had got most of it terribly, terribly wrong. This is not a story about monsters. Or rather, it is not only a story about monsters. This is a story about what happens when multiple people in multiple places across multiple years all see the exact same impossible thing. This is the story of the Grinning Man. Let us begin in the autumn of 1966. The town of Elizabeth, New Jersey, a place of ordinary roads and ordinary people, of school buses and corner stores, of neighbors who waved from their porches and children who played outside until the streetlights came on. It was the kind of town that did not expect the extraordinary. The kind of town where nothing much happened, and then in October of that year something happened that the people who experienced it would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain. Two boys, Marvin Munoz and James Yanchitis, were walking home along the road that ran parallel to the New Jersey Turnpike. The evening was settling in, the light thinning out to that particular shade of blue-gray that October evenings carry like a secret. They were talking the way boys do about nothing in particular when James stopped. He stopped and he pointed, and Marvin looked. Standing behind the chain-link fence that bordered the turnpike, half hidden in the shadows and half standing in a pale shaft of the remaining light, was a man. Except, and this is the part that the boys would struggle to articulate for years afterward, it did not seem entirely like a man. It was the size of a man. It had the shape of a man: 2 legs, 2 arms, a torso, a head. All the components were present, but something about the arrangement of those components, something about the proportions, something about the absolute stillness with which the figure stood made it feel like a rough approximation of a man, like a drawing of a man made by someone who had only ever heard men described. It was tall, enormously, disproportionately tall. The boys estimated later that it stood somewhere between 6 and 6.5 feet in height, though in the half-light and with the shock of the encounter, dimensions become slippery things. It wore something that the boys described as a shiny metallic green suit, not the green of ordinary cloth, but something that seemed to catch and reflect the remaining light in ways that ordinary fabric should not. The suit covered the figure completely, from its neck down to its wrists and ankles. There were no visible seams. There were no buttons or zippers that the boys could make out. The suit looked, in the words they would later use, like a single piece of material, like a shell. But none of that, not the height, not the suit, not the eerie stillness, none of that was the thing that burned itself into the boys' memories and never fully left. The thing that stayed with them, the thing that woke them in the night for months and years afterward, was the face, or rather, it was the smile. The figure had no visible eyes, or if it had eyes, it had no visible eyeballs. The area of the face where eyes should have been appeared smooth and featureless, like the surface of skin stretched across bone with nothing behind it. The nose, too, was barely there, a suggestion rather than a feature. 2 small nostrils set into a face that seemed to lack the kind of 3-dimensional depth that human faces carry. But the mouth was unmistakable. Stretched, and this is the word that every witness in every account always reaches for, it stretched from ear to ear. Literally from ear to ear. A smile of such impossible width that it reorganized the entire architecture of the face around it. A smile that had no joy in it. A smile that had no warmth. A smile that seemed to be a smile only in the most structural, anatomical sense. The lips pulled back, the teeth visible, but which communicated nothing that a smile is supposed to communicate. The boys ran. Of course they ran. You would have run, I would have run. Any creature with a functioning survival instinct would have run from that smile. They ran home and they told their parents, and their parents did what parents in 1966 did. They tried to find a rational explanation. A man in a costume, perhaps, a practical joke, the light playing tricks, except both boys gave identical descriptions independently of one another. Except the descriptions never wavered over subsequent retellings, except neither boy ever retracted a single detail of what they claimed to have seen. And now here's where the story opens up, because James and Marvin were not alone. They were not the only people in New Jersey that autumn who encountered something standing in the shadows with a smile that had no right to exist on a human face. In the weeks surrounding their sighting, in the same general area of northern New Jersey, other witnesses came forward. Other people who in the ordinary course of their ordinary evenings had seen a tall figure in a shiny suit standing and watching. Always watching. Always smiling. The sightings clustered in that particularly strange autumn and early winter of 1966, a period that New Jersey and the surrounding states would come to remember for other reasons too, because that same period saw an explosion of other unexplained phenomena. UFO sightings, strange lights in the sky, the appearance of a creature that witnesses described as massive, winged, and red-eyed, a creature that investigators and journalists would soon be calling the Mothman. And threading through all of it like a sinister needle through dark cloth was the Grinning Man. The researcher who would do more than anyone else to bring the Grinning Man to wider attention was a man named John Keel. Keel was a journalist and an investigator who occupied a fascinating and slightly uncomfortable position in the history of the paranormal. He was not a credulous believer who accepted everything at face value, but he was also not the kind of dismissive skeptic who explained everything away before bothering to examine it. He was instead a rigorous and genuinely curious investigator who followed the evidence wherever it led, even when it led somewhere that made him profoundly uncomfortable. Keel investigated the New Jersey sightings in person. He traveled to Elizabeth. He spoke to witnesses. He collected the testimonies of people who had no reason to fabricate their experiences and who, in many cases, seemed genuinely distressed by what they had seen. And then, because Keel was thorough, because Keel believed in chasing a thread to its end, he kept looking. He looked at other sightings in other places from other years, and he found that the Grinning Man was not a New Jersey phenomenon. The Grinning Man was something else entirely. The Grinning Man, Keel began to suspect, was a repeating figure, a thing that appeared in the margins of other strange events. A character who showed up in the footnotes of the unexplained, standing at the edge of the scene, watching with that impossible smile while the chaos of the inexplicable unfolded around him. The most remarkable of the subsequent encounters that Keel documented came from Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The year was 1967. The town was already in the grip of its own extraordinary season of strangeness. The Mothman sightings were at their height. The silver bridge that crossed the Ohio River was still standing, but would not be standing much longer, and the community of Point Pleasant was living through a period that residents would later describe as feeling almost dreamlike in its accumulated weirdness. It was against this backdrop that a man named Woodrow Derenberger had an encounter that became one of the most extraordinary and well-documented contact claims in the history of American paranormal investigation. Derenberger was driving home from work on the evening of November 2, 1967, along Interstate 77, when he encountered something on the road ahead of him. What he saw and what he described in detail to investigators, to journalists, to John Keel himself was a vehicle of some kind, unusual in appearance, which slowed and came alongside his truck. From this vehicle, a figure emerged. A figure that approached Derenberger's truck and through the window communicated with him. The communication, Derenberger said, was not entirely verbal. It seemed to happen partly in his mind, in the way that you might imagine the words of a sentence before you speak them, except that the words were not his own. The figure introduced itself. It gave a name, Indrid Cold. Indrid Cold, a name that sounds like something constructed from the component parts of names rather than organically arrived at. A name that sits in the mouth strangely, like a word in a language you almost know. And the figure Indrid Cold stood by the truck and looked at Woodrow Derenberger with a face that had almost no features. And it smiled. And the smile was too wide. And the smile did not reach the eyes which were themselves barely there, barely present, barely participating in the construction of a face that seemed to be performing humanity rather than embodying it. Derenberger was terrified. Derenberger was also somehow calm. He described afterward a peculiar quality to the encounter, a sense that he was supposed to be afraid, but that something about the figure's communication, the words or thoughts that passed between them, carried a kind of enforced serenity, as though the smile and the words were working in tandem to produce a state in the witness that was not natural. Indrid Cold told Derenberger in whatever fashion the communication occurred that he came from a place of plentiful happiness, that he meant no harm, that he only wished to observe. And then the figure retreated, the vehicle departed, and Woodrow Derenberger was left alone on the dark highway with a mind full of questions and a face full of the afterimage of that smile, burned in there like a photograph of the sun. Derenberger did not stay quiet about what had happened to him. He reported the encounter to local authorities, who recorded it without particularly knowing what to do with it. He spoke to journalists, he spoke to Keel. He eventually wrote about his experiences in a book, claiming that his contact with Indrid Cold had been ongoing, that the Grinning Man had returned multiple times with messages and observations and that persistent, terrible smile. Whether you believe the literal reality of Derenberger's account is in some ways less interesting than the question of why his account resonated so powerfully with so many people, because it did resonate. Indrid Cold became, in the years following 1967, one of the most enduring figures in American paranormal mythology. The name alone carried a freight of dread. Cold, cold as in temperature, cold as in emotion, cold as in the absence of the warmth that should animate a living face. Indrid Cold, grinning in the dark at the edge of the highway, watching with eyes that should not exist. But let us step back. Let us look at this from a different angle. Because one of the things that makes the grinning man phenomenon genuinely fascinating, genuinely worth sitting with and thinking hard about, is the question of where this image comes from. Why this particular configuration of features? Why the smile? Why the absence of eyes? Why the tall figure in the strange suit? These are not arbitrary details. These details recur across reports from different witnesses, who in many cases had no known contact with one another, who lived in different states, who reported their experiences to different investigators, who had no obvious reason to be coordinating a shared fiction. The consistency of the description is the heart of the mystery, and it is a mystery that does not dissolve easily under the application of the most common explanations. Let us consider those explanations honestly, because they deserve to be considered, because intellectual honesty demands that we look at the mundane possibilities before we go anywhere stranger. The first and most obvious explanation is fabrication, that one or more witnesses made the whole thing up, and that subsequent witnesses were influenced by the original reports, consciously or unconsciously constructing their own experiences to match what they had already heard. This is a reasonable hypothesis. This is the kind of hypothesis that explains a great deal of strange testimony. Human beings are, among their many remarkable qualities, extraordinarily good at constructing false memories that feel as real as genuine experience. We are also in certain psychological states, capable of genuinely believing things that did not happen, of producing sincere testimony about experiences that were confabulated rather than observed. And it is certainly true that by the time Woodrow Derenberger had his encounter in 1967, the New Jersey sightings of 1966 had been reported and discussed in local media. It is conceivable that the image of the grinning man had already lodged in the collective imagination of the region, waiting to be activated by the specific strangeness of that period. The problem with this explanation, not a fatal problem but a real one, is that it requires us to explain why the image that lodged in the collective imagination had the specific features it did. The too wide smile, the absent or barely present eyes, the tall still figure in the shiny suit. These are not the features of any particular popular monster or movie villain from that period. These are not drawn from the obvious cultural reservoir of mid-century American horror. They are oddly specific, oddly consistent, and oddly persistent, because the grinning man reports do not stop in 1967. There is a second category of explanation that is worth considering, one that sits somewhere between the purely psychological and the literally physical. The idea that what witnesses are responding to in some cases may be a real person or a real phenomenon that has been distorted and magnified by the circumstances of the encounter. Consider the conditions under which most grinning man sightings occur. Evening, low light, a witness who is already in a state of some alertness or unease. A figure glimpsed at a distance, or through a fence or from the window of a moving vehicle. Under these conditions, the human perceptual system, which is not a camera, which is not a passive recording device, but an active, interpretive, meaning-making machine, can do extraordinary things. It can take ambiguous visual information and fill it in with the most threatening possible interpretation. It can take a tall man with an unusual gait and a pale face and a moment of eye contact, glimpsed across a dark road, and construct something that bears only a family resemblance to what was actually there. This is not a dismissal of the witnesses. This is a recognition of how human perception actually works. The amygdala, the part of the brain most intimately involved in threat detection, does not wait for complete information before it acts. It fires on partial data. It fires on silhouettes. It fires on the wrongness of proportion, on the uncanny valley quality of a face glimpsed in bad light, on any signal that something in the environment might be a threat. And having fired, it colors the entire memory of the encounter with a particular shade of dread that becomes impossible to separate from what was actually perceived. So it is possible, genuinely possible, that some grinning man encounters are encounters with real people whose appearance, under specific conditions, triggered the threat detection systems of the witnesses in ways that generated a memory considerably more monstrous than the reality. The problem with this explanation is the same problem as the previous one. It accounts for the broad outlines of the phenomenon without fully accounting for the specifics, and those specifics are stubborn. The third category of explanation is the one that Keel himself gravitated toward, and it is the most intellectually adventurous and the most difficult to evaluate. Keel, through his years of investigation, developed a framework for thinking about paranormal phenomena that was neither the credulous acceptance of the literally supernatural nor the dismissive rationalism of the conventional skeptic. He proposed that what witnesses were encountering in UFO sightings, in Mothman encounters, in grinning man reports, was something genuinely real, something that had a physical existence of some kind, but something that was not what it appeared to be. Not aliens in the science fiction sense, not demons in the theological sense, something stranger than both of those, something that occupied a category that our conceptual vocabulary was not equipped to handle. Keel used the term ultraterrestrials, entities that were not from elsewhere in space but from elsewhere in what? In dimension, in time, in some layer of reality that interpenetrates with our own in ways that are ordinarily invisible but that occasionally, under specific conditions, become briefly, disturbingly visible. This is not a scientific hypothesis in the conventional sense. It is not falsifiable in the ways that science demands. But it is a hypothesis that takes the witness testimony seriously, that starts from the position that these people saw something real and works outward from that position to ask what that something could conceivably be. And within that framework, the grinning man takes on a particular character. He is not visiting. He is not passing through. He is a presence, recurring, watching, smiling with that terrible smile that is not a smile, stationed at the edges of events that rupture the ordinary fabric of things, observing whatever it is that he observes, and then retreating back into the darkness he came from. There is something worth examining, too, in the emotional signature of these encounters. The fear that witnesses report is not the fear of physical danger, or at least it is not only that. No grinning man account that has been seriously documented involves a physical attack or any direct threatening behavior. The figure stands, the figure watches, the figure smiles. That is, by and large, all it does. And yet the fear it produces in witnesses is profound and lasting. Marvin Munoz and James Yanchitis were frightened enough to run, and the memory of what they had seen stayed with them. Woodrow Derenberger was frightened enough that even amid the strange serenity that the encounter seemed to induce, he subsequently spent years trying to process what had happened to him. Other witnesses have described a sense of wrongness that they struggled to articulate, not fear of what the figure might do, but fear of what the figure was, fear of its implications. Fear of what it said about the nature of the world if such a thing could exist in it. And that perhaps is the most interesting thing about the grinning man, not what he is, not whether he is literally real in the way that a person or an animal is real, but what he represents, what he functions as in the collective imagination of the people who have encountered him, and the much larger number of people who have heard the accounts and felt inexplicably a faint, cold thread of recognition. Because the grinning man is a particular kind of figure, he is a watcher, he is a presencer. He is the thing at the edge of the known that observes without being invited to observe, that stands on the boundary between the familiar and the incomprehensible and grins as if it knows something we don't, as if the smile is not a greeting but a verdict. And the smile itself deserves more attention. The smile is the detail that persists across every account, the image that every witness reaches for first when they try to describe what they saw, the thing that lodges deepest in the memory and least easily dislodges. Why? What is it about a too-wide smile that produces such visceral, lasting dread? There is a concept in robotics and aesthetics called the uncanny valley, the phenomenon whereby a representation of a human being that is almost but not quite accurate produces a stronger negative reaction than a representation that is obviously artificial. A cartoon face does not disturb us. A clearly inhuman mask does not disturb us in the same way. But a face that is nearly human, that has all the parts and proportions of a human face but arranged with some subtle wrongness, some infinitesimal deviation from the norm, that face produces something that the brain registers as deeply, urgently wrong. The brain that encounters such a face is encountering conflicting signals simultaneously. The face is human, fire the social processing circuits, prepare for interaction. The face is wrong, fire the threat detection circuits, prepare to flee. The two systems engage in a conflict that produces the specific quality of dread that the uncanny valley generates. And a smile that stretches ear to ear, a smile that occupies the wrong proportion of the face, that implies a musculature and a skeletal structure that no human being possesses, that is the uncanny valley rendered in the most intimate possible location. Not a face in a painting, not a figure at a distance. A face smiling at you from a few feet away, a smile that your deep brain registers simultaneously as human expression and as something that has never been human. This is what Marvin and James saw through the chain-link fence. This is what Woodrow Derenberger saw on the highway. This is what something was doing on the night side of New Jersey and West Virginia in the strangest years of the 20th century, smiling. It is also worth considering the specific historical moment in which the grinning man emerged most forcefully. The mid-1960s were a period of extraordinary cultural and social turbulence in America. The country was changing in ways that felt, to many people, profound and destabilizing. The old certainties were loosening, trust in institutions was eroding. The world that had seemed comprehensible and navigable in 1950 seemed, by 1966, to be generating more strangeness than the available frameworks could comfortably accommodate. And in this context, there was a particular proliferation of the unexplained. UFO sightings were at historical highs. The counterculture was generating new forms of experience and new questions about the nature of consciousness, and the paranormal was becoming, paradoxically, more mainstream even as it remained officially incredible. Into this charged atmosphere came the grinning man. And it is impossible not to notice that the grinning man is, among other things, a mirror. He stands at the edge of the ordinary and he watches it. He is present at the moments when the ordinary breaks down. He is there at the scene of the inexplicable, smiling as if he knew this was going to happen. As if he always knew this was going to happen. There is something almost bureaucratic about his presence, not the wild, chaotic energy of a monster, but the cool, attentive observation of something that is keeping notes, something that has seen this kind of thing before. Something that will see it again. The figure of Indrid Cold, the grinning man as he appeared to Woodrow Derenberger, has had a remarkable afterlife in popular culture. The name alone has become something of a touchstone in paranormal circles, a shorthand for a specific quality of encounter. Indrid Cold has appeared in fiction and music, in film. He is referenced in discussions of the Mothman prophecies, in accounts of the broader Point Pleasant phenomenon, in any examination of the strangeness of 1967. The 2002 film The Mothman Prophecies, based on Keel's book, brought the figure to a wider audience, and though the film took considerable liberties with the source material, it captured something essential about the quality of the encounters. The sense that something was watching, that something knew more than it should, that the smile was the last thing you'd want to see in the dark. In the years since, Indrid Cold has become a kind of folk figure of the internet age, referenced in creepypasta, in horror forums, in the kind of collaborative folklore that emerges when communities share and build on stories of the unexplained. This is a fascinating thing in itself. The grinning man has become a cultural artifact as much as a reported phenomenon, and the cultural artifact feeds back into the phenomenon in ways that make it increasingly difficult to separate what people originally saw from what they have come to expect to see. The image is now so thoroughly embedded in the vocabulary of the strange that any subsequent sighting must contend with the question of how much the witness has been shaped by prior knowledge of the reports. And yet the original sightings preceded all of this. The original sightings came from people who had no template for what they were seeing, who reached for comparisons and found nothing adequate, who described the same impossible features over and over not because they had read about them but because they had seen them, or believed they had seen them with the same conviction that they brought to everything else they had ever witnessed in their lives. Let us talk about mass hysteria. It is a term that gets deployed in the history of the unexplained with a frequency and a confidence that sometimes outpaces its actual explanatory power. Mass hysteria, or in the more careful clinical language, mass psychogenic illness or mass sociogenic illness, is a real phenomenon. It has been documented in controlled environments, in schools and factories and communities under stress. It describes the process by which anxiety, fear, and social contagion can produce genuine physical symptoms and genuine perceptual experiences in groups of people without any underlying physical cause. It is not nothing. It is not an insult to the people who experience it. The experiences are real even when their external cause is not. But mass hysteria is a specific thing with specific parameters. It tends to occur in populations that are under significant stress. It tends to involve physical symptoms, nausea, fainting, trembling, more often than specific shared visual hallucinations. And it tends to cluster and spread along social networks, meaning that you can typically trace a pattern of who told whom and when. The grinning man sightings do not fit neatly into this template. The witnesses in New Jersey in 1966 were not reporting from within a community that was demonstrably under unusual stress. The witnesses in West Virginia in 1967 were admittedly part of a community that was experiencing a great deal of collective strangeness, but the grinning man accounts from that period are specific and detailed in ways that diverge from the typical signature of mass psychogenic events. This does not mean that the grinning man is real in a literal physical sense. It means that mass hysteria is not a sufficient explanation by itself. The mystery remains open. As the best mysteries always do. What we are left with at the end of all this is something that resists resolution with a particular stubbornness. We have credible witnesses. We have consistent descriptions. We have a figure that recurs across time and geography in ways that are difficult to attribute to simple coincidence or contamination. And we have the image itself, indelible, terrible, precise, of something standing in the dark with a smile that was never meant for human faces, something tall and still and watchful. Something in a shiny suit that caught the light wrong. Something with eyes that were barely there, barely participating in the theater of a face. Something that watched two boys through a chain-link fence in New Jersey and watched a truck driver on a West Virginia highway and has been watching, according to scattered reports from scattered places across the subsequent decades. Whenever the world tears a little at its edges and whatever lives in the tear steps briefly into view, that smile. That is the thing you keep coming back to. Long after the details blur, long after the names and the places and the specific circumstances have faded, the smile remains, stretched ear to ear, impossibly wide, communicating nothing that a smile is supposed to communicate and yet communicating something. Something that the witnesses understood in a place below language, below reason, below the reach of the ordinary processes by which we make sense of the world. A smile that said, I know you. I have always known you. I have been here longer than you have been looking, and I will still be here, smiling in the dark, long after you stop. There is a particular quality to the fear that the grinning man produces, and we keep circling back to it because it seems important, It is not the fear of violence, it is not the fear of pain. It is the fear of being known by something that has no right to know you, of being observed by something that sees through you rather than at you. The smile is the expression not of malice exactly but of a kind of terrible intimacy, of recognition. As if the grinning man has been watching you specifically, not just humans in general but you, has watched you your entire life from a distance you did not know was penetrable, and in this moment of sudden visibility is acknowledging with that terrible smile that the watching is not new, that it has always been happening, that you have always been seen. And that there is nothing you can do about it now except run, which is what the boys did in New Jersey, which is what every sane person who has looked into that face has eventually done. You run, and behind you in the dark, in the silence that closes after your footsteps have faded, the smile remains, because the smile was never going anywhere. The smile has nowhere else to be. It has been here before the roads were built and the fences were put up and the lights were strung along the highway. And it will be here when all of that is gone, standing in whatever darkness remains, grinning at nothing, grinning at everything, grinning at whatever comes next in the long, strange story of a world that has never been as ordinary as it wanted to be. This is the strange case of the smiling stranger. This is the testimony of the people who saw him and never fully recovered from the seeing. This is the mystery that remains open, that remains unresolved, that remains exactly as strange today as it was on that October evening in New Jersey when two boys looked through a chain-link fence and saw a face that should not have been there looking back at them with a smile that should not have existed on anything that breathed and walked and stood in the world alongside the rest of us. The case is still open. The witnesses are still out there, some of them still carrying the image in the place behind the eyes where the deepest memories live. And somewhere, in the dark at the edge of some road, behind some fence, at the margin of some event that has not happened yet, there is something tall and still and watchful and smiling, waiting to be seen again. Waiting with the patience of something that has never needed to hurry because it has always known with a certainty expressed in the permanent geometry of that impossible smile that sooner or later you will walk past. Sooner or later the light will be just right, and sooner or later you will look.